What does it take for a man to face his deepest fear? For Eli Morgan, a solitary rancher in the vast landscapes of New Mexico, that fear had a name: fire. For 7 years, he had lived in the shadow of flames that had consumed everything he held dear. But on one storm-ravaged night in 1952, when lightning split the sky and thunder shook the earth, fate would demand he choose between his paralyzing terror and the life of a stranger. Sometimes, the very thing that destroys us becomes the path to our salvation. Sometimes, courage isn't the absence of fear, it's what we do despite it. And sometimes, in the most unlikely circumstances, two broken souls find in each other the strength to heal. This is the story of how one man's greatest weakness became his greatest strength, and how an act of desperate bravery changed two lives forever. But before we begin, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us where you're listening from. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Morgan ranch, its golden rays struggling to warm the cold stone that had settled in Eli's chest 7 years ago. He stood on the weathered porch of his modest cabin, coffee growing cold in his calloused hands, watching the distant mountains blur through the heat haze. At 32, his face bore lines deeper than his years warranted, carved by grief and solitude. The ranch stretched for miles in every direction, a kingdom of red earth, sparse grass, and stubborn cattle that somehow thrived in this harsh corner of New Mexico. It had been in his family for 3 generations, built by his grandfather's steady hands and his father's unwavering determination. Now it was his alone, a burden he carried with the same grim resolve that got him through each day. Eli's horse, a sturdy bay mare named Copper, whinnied softly from a corral, reminding him that the world continued to turn regardless of his brooding. He drained his coffee and walked toward the barn, his boots crunching on the dry earth. The familiar rhythm of ranch work awaited, checking the fence line, tending to the cattle, maintaining the windmill that drew precious water from deep underground. As he saddled Copper, his eyes unconsciously avoided the blackened foundation stones visible in the distance. Even after 7 years, he couldn't bring himself to clear them away. They stood as a monument to his failure, a reminder of the night when fire had taken everything: his wife Sarah, their unborn child, and the dream of the life they'd planned together. The flames had moved so fast. One moment he'd been in the barn, securing the horses as the wind picked up. The next he'd turned to see their home engulfed in an inferno that seemed to reach toward the very stars. By the time he'd reached the house, the roof had already collapsed. The heat had been so intense it had singed his eyebrows and left permanent scars on his forearms, marks he bore like badges of his inadequacy. Should have been faster, he muttered to himself, the same words he'd spoken countless times. Should have been there. Copper snorted and stamped, sensing his mood. Animals always knew. They understood grief in ways humans pretended not to. Eli patted her neck gently, finding comfort in her warm, steady presence. The ride to the north pasture took him past the old Apache trail that wound through the rocky outcroppings. His neighbor, Tom Brennan, had warned him about Indian troubles when he'd first inherited the ranch, but Eli had never seen evidence of any conflict. The Apache had been moved to reservations years ago, though he'd occasionally spotted smoke signals rising from the mesas or found evidence of temporary camps near the water sources. He'd always felt a kinship with their displacement. In different ways, they'd both been forced from the lives they'd known, left to adapt to a world that seemed determined to break them. The cattle were scattered across the pasture, some seeking shade under the few scraggly mesquite trees, others grazing near the stock tank. Eli counted them methodically, checking for signs of illness or injury. It was mindless work, the kind that let his thoughts wander to darker places if he wasn't careful. A movement caught his eye near the eastern boundary. A woman walked along the ridge, moving with the fluid grace of someone who knew the land intimately. Even from a distance, he could see she was Apache. Her long black hair caught the sunlight, and she wore traditional clothing that seemed to blend with the desert landscape. She carried something in her arms, walking with the careful gait of someone bearing precious cargo. For a moment, their eyes met across the distance. She paused, studying him with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. Then, without acknowledgement, she continued on her way, disappearing behind a cluster of boulders. Eli found himself curious about her presence. The reservation was 20 miles east, and it was unusual to see anyone this far from the main settlements. But then again, he'd made it his business to know as little as possible about his neighbors, Apache or otherwise. Solitude was his armor, and he wore it faithfully. The day wore on with the relentless heat that defined summer in New Mexico. By evening, Eli had completed his rounds, repaired a section of fence damaged by cattle, and checked the water levels in all the tanks. The work was good for him. It kept his hands busy and his mind focused on immediate, solvable problems. As he unsaddled Copper and gave her fresh oats, dark clouds began building on the horizon. The air felt heavy, charged with the promise of rain. In this drought-stricken land, storms were both blessing and curse, bringing life-giving water, but also the threat of flash floods, and, most terrifying of all, lightning strikes that could ignite the dry grass and scrub brush. Eli's jaw tightened as he watched the approaching storm. Every bolt of lightning was a potential enemy, every gust of wind a threat that could fan sparks into an inferno. He'd learned to read the signs, to prepare for the worst while hoping for the best. Inside his cabin, he lit a kerosene lamp and prepared a simple meal of beans and cornbread. The walls were bare except for a few practical items: a calendar, a weather almanac, and a faded photograph of his parents that he'd salvaged from the old house. There were no pictures of Sarah. Those had all been lost in the fire, and the pain of her absence was too raw for such reminders. Thunder rumbled in the distance, closer now. The storm was coming whether he was ready or not. As he ate his supper, Eli tried to push down the familiar anxiety that rose in his chest whenever the weather turned threatening. He'd survived 7 years of storms since the fire. He would survive this one too. But as lightning began to flicker on the horizon, illuminating the clouds in brief, brilliant flashes, Eli Morgan had no idea that this night would demand everything he thought he'd lost: his courage, his compassion, and his willingness to risk everything for someone he'd never met. The storm was coming, and with it, a chance for redemption that would either save him or destroy him completely. The storm struck with the fury of an angry god, transforming the peaceful evening into chaos. Rain hammered against the cabin windows in sheets, driven by winds that howled like banshees across the open range. Eli sat at his kitchen table, every muscle in his body tense, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. Each flash of lightning sent ice through his veins. Each rumble of thunder made his heart race. He'd positioned himself where he could see through the window, watching for any signs of fire on the horizon. This was his ritual during storms, a vigil of terror that he couldn't break himself of, no matter how irrational he knew it to be. The clock on the mantel ticked toward midnight. The storm showed no signs of abating. If anything, it seemed to be intensifying. A particularly bright flash lit up the landscape, and in that brief moment of illumination, Eli saw something that made his blood freeze. Smoke, rising from the direction of the old Apache trail. "No," he whispered, pressing his face to the window. "Please, no." Another lightning strike confirmed his worst fears. About 2 miles east, orange flames were visible through the rain, dancing against the darkness like demons celebrating their escape from hell. The old line shack that sat near the spring, the one his grandfather had built as a way station for travelers, was burning. Eli's first instinct was to retreat deeper into his cabin, to close the curtains and wait for the storm to pass. Fire was not his problem. Fire was his enemy. Fire was the thing that had destroyed his life and left him hollow inside. But as he watched, paralyzed by indecision, he saw movement near the burning structure. A figure stumbled from the building, fell to their knees, then collapsed completely. Even through the rain and distance, Eli could see it was a woman, the same woman he'd seen earlier that day. She wasn't moving. "Damn it," he breathed, his hands shaking as he reached for his coat. Every instinct screamed at him to stay away, to let nature take its course. But something deeper than fear was stirring in his chest, a voice that sounded suspiciously like Sarah's, reminding him of the man he used to be. The man who would have run toward danger, not away from it. The man who would have tried to save her. Eli grabbed his medical kit, a rope, and a heavy blanket. His hands fumbled with the lantern, nearly dropping it twice before he managed to light it. Copper stood in the barn, ears flattened against the storm, but she allowed him to saddle her despite the chaos outside. The ride to the burning shack was a nightmare of wind, rain, and flashing light. Every lightning strike made Copper shy and dance, and Eli had to fight to keep her moving forward. His own terror was a living thing in his chest, clawing at his throat and making it hard to breathe. As they got closer, the heat from the fire became noticeable even through the rain. The old shack was completely engulfed, flames reaching toward the sky like grasping fingers. The woman lay about 30 feet from the building, unmoving in the mud. Eli dismounted and approached her cautiously. She was Apache, as he'd suspected, probably in her mid-20s, with long black hair that was now matted with mud and rain. Her clothes were torn and singed, and she was unconscious. But what made his heart stop was the obvious swell of her belly beneath her dress. She was pregnant, very pregnant. "Ma'am," he called out, dropping to his knees beside her. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" She didn't respond. Her breathing was shallow, and he could see burn marks on her arms and legs. She must have been caught in the shack when the lightning struck, fought her way out, and collapsed from smoke inhalation or injury. The fire was spreading despite the rain, creeping toward the dry grass and brush. If the wind shifted, it could race across the range, consuming everything in its path, including them. Eli knew he had to move her, had to get her away from the danger. But touching her, helping her, meant confronting the flames that had haunted his nightmares for 7 years. It meant facing the enemy that had taken everything from him. "Sarah," he whispered, looking up at the storm-torn sky. "I don't know if I can do this." Thunder crashed overhead, and in that moment, the unconscious woman stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, dark and filled with pain. When she saw him, they widened with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. "Please," she whispered in accented English. "My baby, something's wrong." That was when Eli noticed the blood soaking through her dress. She wasn't just injured from a fire. She was in labor, and something was very wrong. The next few minutes passed in a blur of desperate action. Eli wrapped her in the blanket, lifted her as gently as he could, and secured her on Kappa's back. The horse, sensing the urgency, stood perfectly still despite the chaos around them. "What's your name?" he asked as he mounted behind her, holding her steady. "Aiyana," she managed between labored breaths. "My name is Aiyana. I'm Eli. I'm going to get you somewhere safe." The ride back to his cabin was harrowing. Aiyana drifted in and out of consciousness, occasionally crying out in pain. Each contraction seemed to grow stronger, and Eli knew with growing dread that this baby was coming whether they were ready or not. When they reached the cabin, he carried her inside and laid her on his bed. By the light of the kerosene lamp, he could see the full extent of her injuries. Burns on her arms and legs, smoke inhalation that made her breathing labored, and the unmistakable signs of a labor that was progressing too quickly. "The baby," she gasped, gripping his hand with surprising strength. "Something's wrong. It's too early." Eli's medical knowledge was limited to treating injured cattle and basic first aid, but he could see she was right. The baby was coming, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. No doctor, no midwife, no help of any kind except what he could provide. "Aiyana," he said, looking directly into her eyes, "I'm going to help you. I promise." She nodded, trusting him with a faith he didn't feel he deserved. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the cabin, a different kind of struggle was beginning. A battle between life and death, hope and despair, courage and fear. As Eli gathered clean cloths and hot water, he realized that the fire he'd spent 7 years running from had finally caught up with him. Not in the way he'd expected, but in the form of a woman who needed him to be stronger than his fears, braver than his pain. The night was far from over, and the hardest part was yet to come. The cabin filled with the sounds of struggle, Aiyana's labored breathing, the storm hammering against the windows, and Eli's own heartbeat thundering in his ears. He'd delivered calves before, but this was different. This was a human life, possibly two, hanging in the balance. Aiyana's contractions were coming fast now, too fast. She gripped the sheets with white knuckles, her face pale and streaked with sweat. The burns on her arms were blistering, and her breathing was still labored from the smoke she'd inhaled. "It's too early," she whispered between contractions. "The baby, it's not ready." Eli knelt beside the bed, his hand steady despite the turmoil in his chest. "How early?" 7 months, maybe 8. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "I was staying in the shack waiting." "Waiting for what?" She looked at him with eyes that held depths of pain he couldn't fathom. "For my husband to come back. He went to town 3 days ago. Said he'd return before the baby came." The words hit Eli like a physical blow. A husband. She had a husband who was probably searching for her right now, frantic with worry. Here he was, alone with another man's wife, delivering another man's child, and all he could think about was how right it felt to be helping someone again. "He'll come," Eli said, though he wasn't sure he believed it. "But right now, we need to focus on you and the baby." Another contraction seized her, stronger than the ones before. She cried out, and Eli saw the fear in her eyes. The same fear he'd seen in Sarah's face in his nightmares, the terror of someone who knew they might not survive. "I need to check how far along you are," he said gently. Is that all right?" She nodded, biting her lip. Eli had never felt more out of his depth, but he forced himself to think logically. He'd read medical books after Sarah's death, trying to understand what he might have done differently. Some of that knowledge was coming back to him now. What he discovered made his heart sink. The baby was coming, and there was no stopping it. But its position was wrong, breech, which meant the delivery would be complicated and dangerous for both mother and child. "Aiyana," he said, trying to keep his voice calm. "The baby is positioned wrong. It's going to be difficult, but I'm going to do everything I can to help you both." She nodded, her eyes never leaving his face. "I trust you." Those 3 words carried more weight than any he'd heard in 7 years. Someone trusted him. Someone believed he could save them instead of failing them. The responsibility was terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. The next hour passed in a blur of controlled chaos. Eli worked with steady hands, remembering everything he'd learned from books and from experience with livestock. The baby was small, too small, but it was alive and fighting, just like its mother. "I can see the feet," he said, hope creeping into his voice. "That's good. The baby's coming." Aiyana bore down with each contraction, her strength remarkable given her injuries. Between pushes, she told him fragments of her story, how she'd married a man named Joseph from the reservation, how they'd planned to build a life together, how she'd been waiting in the old shack because it was halfway between the reservation and the town where he'd gone to buy supplies. "The lightning," she gasped. "It hit the roof. Everything happened so fast." Eli understood that terror better than anyone. Fire was merciless, consuming everything in its path, without discrimination. But unlike his experience, this story might have a different ending. "The baby's head is coming," he said, his voice tight with concentration. "One more push, Aiyana. One more, and your child will be here." She gathered her strength and pushed with everything she had. The baby slipped into Eli's waiting hands, tiny, perfect, and completely still. No cry, no movement, no breath. "Is it?" Aiyana's voice was weak, hopeful. Eli looked down at the infant in his hands. A boy, perfectly formed but so small, so still. His throat tightened, and for a moment, he was back in the ashes of his burned home, holding what remained of his own dreams. But then he remembered something from the medical books. Sometimes babies born early needed help starting to breathe. Sometimes they just needed someone to fight for them. He cleared the baby's mouth and nose, then began gently rubbing his chest and back. "Come on," he whispered. "Come on, little one." Nothing. Eli brought the baby to his mouth and breathed gently into his lungs, then rubbed his chest again. Still nothing. "Please," Aiyana begged from the bed. "Please, is he?" "No," Eli said firmly. "No, he's not. He's just figuring things out." He tried again, breathing life into the tiny lungs, massaging the small chest. His own breathing was ragged with desperation. He couldn't fail again. He couldn't let death win again. "Come on," he said, his voice breaking. "Come on, son. Your mother needs you. Your father needs you. The world needs you." And then, like a miracle wrapped in flesh and blood, The baby gasped. A small, weak cry escaped his lips, followed by another, stronger one. His tiny fists clenched, and his legs kicked with sudden life. Eli's eyes filled with tears as he wrapped the baby in a clean cloth and placed him on his mother's chest. "He's breathing," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "He's alive." Aiyana's face transformed with joy and relief. Despite her exhaustion, despite her injuries, she smiled as she looked down at her son. "Hello, little warrior," she whispered. "I knew you would fight." The baby was small, probably only 4 pounds, but his cry was growing stronger. Eli knew he would need special care, warmth, and frequent feeding, but he was alive. Against all odds, he was alive. "Thank you," Aiyana said, looking up at Eli with tears in her eyes. "Thank you for saving us both." Eli couldn't speak. He sat back on his heels, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had just happened. For the first time in 7 years, he had helped bring life into the world instead of watching it be taken away. Outside, the storm was beginning to calm. The thunder was more distant now, and the rain had gentled to a steady patter against the windows. Dawn was still hours away, but something had shifted in the darkness. Something had changed. As Eli cleaned up and made sure both mother and baby were comfortable, he realized that his hands were steady, his breathing calm. The terror that had gripped him for so long had loosened its hold, replaced by something he'd almost forgotten he could feel. Purpose, hope, the possibility of redemption. The baby stirred in his mother's arms, and Aiyana began to sing softly in Apache, her voice barely audible but filled with love. The melody was ancient, beautiful, and somehow familiar, as if the land itself was welcoming this new life. But even as peace settled over the cabin, Eli knew their challenges were far from over. The baby was premature and fragile. Aiyana needed medical attention for her burns. And somewhere out there, a husband was probably searching desperately for his missing wife. The night had tested them all, but it had also given them something precious, a chance to start over, to build something new from the ashes of their fears. As Eli settled into a chair to keep watch over them both, he found himself thinking about Sarah for the first time in months, without the familiar stab of pain. Instead, he felt her presence like a gentle hand on his shoulder, approving of what he'd done, proud of the man he'd chosen to be when it mattered most. The storm was passing, and with it, 7 years of darkness. Dawn was coming, and with it, the possibility of a new beginning. The first light of dawn crept through the cabin windows, soft and golden, painting the walls with hope. Eli had dozed fitfully in his chair, waking every few minutes to check on Aiyana and the baby. Both were sleeping peacefully now. The crisis passed, but the challenges of the coming day looming large. The baby was so small in his mother's arms, wrapped in one of Eli's old shirts that had been clean and soft. His breathing was steady but rapid, and Eli knew he needed to stay warm and fed. Aiyana herself was pale but stable, her burns cleaned and bandaged with what supplies he had. A sound outside made Eli's head snap up. Hoofbeats, coming fast. He moved to the window and saw a rider approaching, a young Apache man on a paint horse, his face etched with exhaustion and desperate worry. The husband. Eli stepped onto the porch as the man dismounted, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "She's here," he called out. "She's safe." The man's relief was palpable. He was probably in his mid-20s, tall and lean, with the kind of quiet strength that came from living close to the land. His eyes, dark and intelligent, searched Eli's face for signs of deception. "I am Joseph Crowfeather," he said, his English careful but clear. "Where's my wife?" "Inside. She's been hurt, but she's alive." "The baby?" Eli paused, unsure how to explain the miracle of the night. "The baby came early, but he's alive too." Joseph's knees nearly buckled with relief. "The baby is born, but it's too soon." "It was touch and go," Eli said gently. "But they're both fighters. Would you like to see them?" Joseph nodded, following Eli into the cabin. When he saw Aiyana holding their son, his composure finally cracked. He dropped to his knees beside the bed, tears streaming down his face as he reached out to touch his wife's hand. "Aiyana," he whispered, "I'm so sorry. I should have been there. I should have come back sooner." She smiled weakly, lifting her free hand to cup his cheek. "You're here now. That's what matters." Joseph looked down at his son, his expression filled with wonder and fear. "He's so small, but strong," Eli said. "He fought hard to get here." Joseph looked up at him, and Eli saw something shift in his expression. "You delivered my son?" "I helped," Eli said simply. "Your wife did the hard work. You saved them both." Joseph stood and faced Eli directly. "I owe you a debt I can never repay." Eli shook his head. "No debt. Anyone would have done the same." "No," Joseph said firmly. "Not anyone. Many would have turned away. You risked your life to bring her out of the fire." The word fire hung in the air between them. Eli felt the old familiar tightness in his chest, but it was different now. The fear was still there, but it no longer controlled him. "I lost my wife in a fire 7 years ago," Eli said quietly. "I've been running from flames ever since. Last night, I couldn't run anymore." Joseph studied him with new understanding. "The fire took something from you, but last night you took something back." It was a profound observation, and Eli felt the truth of it resonate in his bones. He had taken something back, not just his courage, but his sense of purpose, his connection to the world around him. "The baby needs special care," Eli said, changing the subject. "He's small, and he'll need to be kept warm and fed frequently. I don't know much about caring for premature infants, but I have some medical books." "There's a woman on the reservation," Joseph said. "Mary Blackhorse. She has helped many babies who came early, but we cannot move Aiyana yet, not with her injuries." "Then we'll bring Mary here," Eli said without hesitation. "Whatever you need." Joseph looked surprised. "You would do that? Allow Apache people to come to your land?" "Your son was born here," Eli said simply. "That makes this his home too, at least for now." Over the next several hours, the cabin filled with quiet activity. Joseph rode to fetch Mary Blackhorse, who turned out to be a wise, elderly woman with gentle hands and a vast knowledge of traditional healing. She brought herbs for Aiyana's burns and showed Eli how to care for the premature infant. "He will need milk from his mother every 2 hours," Mary explained, "and he must be kept warm always. Skin-to-skin contact is best." Eli found himself learning alongside Joseph, both men united in their determination to help the tiny fighter survive. The baby, who they named Thomas, after Aiyana's grandfather, seemed to grow stronger by the hour, his cries becoming more vigorous, his grip on their fingers firmer. As the days passed, an unexpected friendship began to form. Joseph shared stories of his people's connection to the land, their understanding of the cycles of life and death, fire and renewal. Eli found himself talking about Sarah for the first time in years, not just about her death, but about her life, her dreams, her laughter. "Fire destroys," Joseph said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, "but it also clears the way for new growth. The land knows this. Now you know it too." Mary worked her healing magic on Aiyana, treating her burns with traditional remedies that seemed to work better than anything Eli had tried. More importantly, she helped Aiyana process the trauma of the fire, teaching her songs and rituals that would help her heal emotionally as well as physically. "Fire is sacred to our people," Mary told Eli one day. "It can destroy, yes, but it also purifies. It takes away the old to make room for the new." Eli thought about this as he watched little Thomas sleep in his mother's arms. The child was thriving now, gaining weight and strength with each passing day. His parents were healing too, their love for each other and their son creating a warmth that filled the cabin with something Eli had almost forgotten existed. A week after the birth, as Aiyana was finally strong enough to travel, the family prepared to return to the reservation. The parting was bittersweet. Eli had grown attached to all of them, but especially to the baby who had changed his life simply by fighting to live. "You will always be welcome in our home," Joseph said, clasping Eli's hand. "You are family now." Aiyana, holding Thomas, looked up at Eli with tears in her eyes. "Thank you for giving me my son, for giving us both a second chance." "Thank you for giving me one too," Eli replied. As they rode away, Eli stood on his porch and watched until they disappeared over the ridge. The cabin felt empty without them, but it was a different kind of emptiness than he'd known before. This was the quiet that comes after a storm, peaceful and full of possibility. That evening, as he sat at his table eating supper, Eli found himself thinking about the burned foundation stones that still sat on his land. For 7 years, he'd avoided them, unable to face the reminder of his loss. But now, as the last light of day faded into darkness, he made a decision. He walked to the old foundation, carrying a kerosene lamp, and stood looking at the blackened stones. They were just rocks now, weathered by time and rain, no longer the monument to failure he'd imagined them to be. "I'm sorry, Sarah," he said aloud. "I'm sorry I couldn't save you. But I saved them. I saved Aiyana and Thomas, and maybe that's enough." The wind whispered through the desert grass, and for a moment, Eli could have sworn he heard Sarah's voice carried on the breeze, telling him it was more than enough. It was everything. The next morning, he began clearing the foundation stones, not to erase the memory of what had been, but to prepare the ground for what might be. He would build something new here, not a replacement for what he'd lost, but a testament to what he'd found. 3 months later, when Joseph and Aiyana brought Thomas for a visit, the new barn stood complete. It was larger than the old house had been, with space for community gatherings and a workshop where Eli had begun teaching Joseph and other young men from the reservation about ranching and livestock care. Little Thomas, now chubby and healthy, gurgled happily in his mother's arms as she showed him the place where he'd been born. The baby seemed to recognize Eli, reaching out with chubby fingers to grasp his scarred hand. "He knows you," Aiyana said, smiling. "He knows you're the one who brought him into the world." Eli looked down at the thriving child and felt a peace he hadn't known in years. The fire had taken everything from him once, but it had also given him something precious, the knowledge that he was capable of saving lives, not just losing them. As the sun set over the New Mexico desert, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Eli Morgan stood, surrounded by the family he'd helped create and the community he'd begun to build. The lonely rancher who had once feared fire now understood its true nature, not as destroyer, but as transformer, clearing away the old to make room for new growth. The flames that had haunted his nightmares for 7 years had finally been replaced by something warmer, brighter, and infinitely more powerful. The fire of human connection, the flame of hope, and the eternal light of love conquering fear. In the distance, smoke rose from the chimneys of the Apache reservation, carrying with it the prayers and dreams of a people who understood that every ending was also a beginning, every loss an opportunity for renewal. And in his heart, Eli Morgan finally understood that sometimes the very thing we fear most becomes the path to our greatest triumph. 5 years later, the Morgan Ranch had become something no one could have imagined. What had started as a place of solitude and sorrow had transformed into a thriving community center where Apache families and local ranchers worked together, sharing knowledge and building bridges between cultures that had been divided for generations. Eli, now 37, had silver threading through his dark hair, but his eyes held a warmth that had been missing for years. He stood in the doorway of the schoolhouse he'd built, watching as Mary Blackhorse taught a group of children, both Apache and white, about the medicinal properties of desert plants. Among the children was Thomas Crow Feather, now a sturdy 5-year-old with his father's quiet strength and his mother's gentle spirit. He sat cross-legged on the floor, listening intently as Mary explained how certain herbs could heal burns. "Mr. Eli," Thomas called out, spotting him in the doorway. "Mary is telling us about the plants that helped my mother." Eli smiled and walked over, ruffling the boy's hair. "Is she now? What have you learned?" "That fire can hurt, but the earth gives us medicine to heal," Thomas said solemnly, "and that sometimes bad things happen so good things can grow." The wisdom of a child, Eli thought, spoken with the innocence that made profound truths seem simple. Later that evening, as the last of the visitors departed and the ranch settled into peaceful quiet, Eli sat on his porch with a cup of coffee and a letter that had arrived that morning. It was from a doctor in Santa Fe who had heard about the work being done at the ranch. The integration of traditional Apache healing methods with modern medicine the success they'd had in treating burns and other injuries. The doctor wanted to visit, to learn from Mary Blackhorse and document her methods for the benefit of other medical practitioners. It was exactly the kind of recognition that Mary deserved, and Eli felt proud to have played a small part in making it possible. Joseph appeared around the corner of the house, leading his horse after a long day of helping with the cattle. The two men had become more than friends. They were brothers in every way that mattered, bound together by the night that had changed both their lives. "How is little Thomas?" Eli asked. "Growing like a weed," Joseph replied with a grin. "Aiyana says he's going to be tall like his father, but stubborn like his mother." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. The desert was alive with the sounds of evening, coyotes calling in the distance, the whisper of wind through the sage, the gentle lowing of cattle settling for the night. "Do you ever think about that night?" Joseph asked quietly. "The night Thomas was born." Eli nodded. "Every day. But not the way I used to think about the fire that took Sarah. That night taught me something I'd forgotten." "What's that?" "That courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing what needs to be done despite the fear." Eli took a sip of his coffee. "I was terrified that night. Terrified of the fire. Terrified I'd fail again. Terrified I'd lose someone else I cared about. But I did it anyway." Joseph smiled. "And because you did, my son is alive. My wife is alive. And you." He paused, searching for the right words. "You found your way back to yourself." A comfortable silence fell between them again. In the distance, they could see the warm glow of lights from the Apache reservation, and closer by, the lights of other ranches where neighbors, who had once been strangers, now shared meals and stories. "I have something to tell you," Joseph said eventually. "Aiyana is pregnant again." Eli's face lit up with joy. "That's wonderful news. How is she feeling?" "Good. Strong. But she asked me to ask you something." Joseph's expression grew serious. "She wants to know if you'll be there when the baby comes. She says she can't imagine having a child without you present." Eli felt a warmth spread through his chest. "Of course. I'd be honored. And this time," Joseph added with a grin, "we'll make sure to have the baby somewhere with a proper roof and a real bed." They both laughed, the sound carrying across the desert night. It was the laughter of men who had faced their deepest fears and emerged stronger, of friends who had found family in the most unexpected places. As the evening deepened, Aiyana appeared on the porch, carrying a sleeping Thomas. She'd grown even more beautiful in the years since that terrible night. Her scars faded to thin white lines that told a story of survival and strength. "Time for bed, little warrior," she whispered to her son, then looked up at Eli with a smile. "Joseph told you our news?" "He did. Congratulations." Eli stood and gently touched the boy's forehead. "Thomas is going to be a wonderful big brother." "He's already practicing," Aiyana said with a laugh. "He's been talking to my belly, telling the baby about the ranch and about his Uncle Eli, who saved him from the fire." Uncle Eli. The title filled him with more pride than he'd ever felt, owning thousands of acres of land or hundreds of head of cattle. This was what truly mattered. Not what you owned, but who you loved and who loved you in return. After they went inside to put Thomas to bed, Eli remained on the porch, looking out at the land that had shaped him, broken him, and ultimately healed him. The foundation stones of his old house were gone now, replaced by a garden where Aiyana grew the herbs and vegetables that fed their extended family. It was a living memorial to Sarah, not a monument to death, but a celebration of life. A movement in the darkness caught his eye. A young Apache woman was walking along the ridge, just as Aiyana had done all those years ago. But this time, Eli felt no unease. The land was big enough for all of them, and there was room at his table for anyone who needed shelter, healing, or simply a place to belong. The woman paused and looked down at the ranch, at the warm lights spilling from the windows, at the smoke rising peacefully from the chimneys. She raised her hand in a small wave, and Eli waved back, a gesture of welcome and understanding. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to help and heal and grow. There would be cattle to tend, fences to mend, and lessons to teach. There would be Mary's wisdom to learn from, Joseph's friendship to cherish, and a growing family to love and protect. But tonight, Eli Morgan sat on his porch and felt something he hadn't experienced in 7 long years: perfect peace. The fire that had once consumed his world had been transformed into something beautiful, a warmth that brought people together, a light that guided the lost home, and a flame that would burn brightly for generations to come. In the distance, a coyote called out to the moon, and somewhere in the desert, new life was stirring, growing, preparing to face whatever challenges awaited. The cycle continued, as it always had and always would: destruction and renewal, fear and courage, death and rebirth. And in the heart of a man who had learned that sometimes the thing we fear most becomes the source of our greatest strength, the fire of hope burned eternal, warming not just himself, but everyone whose life he touched. The lonely rancher who had once feared fire had become the keeper of a flame that would never go out, the flame of love, community, and the unshakable belief that every ending is also a beginning, every loss an opportunity for something beautiful to grow. As the last light faded from the western sky, Eli Morgan went inside to join his chosen family, carrying with him the knowledge that he had finally found his way home, not to a place, but to the person he was always meant to be. The fire had taken everything from him once, but in return, it had given him everything that truly mattered: the courage to love again, the wisdom to heal, and the strength to build something lasting from the ashes of the past. And in the desert night, the stars looked down on a ranch that had become a beacon of hope, a testament to the power of human connection, and proof that even in the darkest moments, the light of compassion can overcome any fear. If you like this story, leave your opinion in the comments and, of course, leave a like and subscribe. Turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any videos. Big hug and see you soon.